It's the week ending Saturday, the 5th of February, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen failures of leadership and judgment, highlighted by the Sue Gray report into Downing Street parties, Premiership footballer Mason Greenwood arrested on suspicions of sexual assault and threats to kill, and viral word game Wordle, bought by the New York Times for a 7-figure sum. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Sorcha Bradley. From the Week Junior, we have the return of editor Felicity Capon. And from Money Week, the man who, according to our listener Christina on Twitter, quote, gives taxi driver with strong opinion energy, it's John Stepek. And John, I hear this may be your last appearance for a while as you focus on your clearly less important day job.
Yeah, I mean, I was hoping to get cancelled, but that's not happened yet. So
it's still all to play for.
Yeah, exactly.
Anything could happen in the next 45 minutes. Well, we hope to have you back soon after this, John. You are a valued contributor to the show. Felicity, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this the week we learn that liberty, equality and fraternity are once again being challenged in France?
No. Come on, do you like Eric Zemmour?
No, it's not a good person.
Why?
Because he don't like the Arabic people.
He's a racist.
He's racist.
Why do you think he's so popular?
Because in France there are many racist people.
Do you think that France is facing big problems that Eric Zemmour is being honest about?
I don't think that, because in France there are many problems, and Eric Zemmour talk about immigration. And in France, there are many problems, not immigration especially.
Who would you vote for?
For Jean-Luc Mélenchon.
Yes, for Jean-Luc Mélenchon.
Jean-Luc Mélenchon is a very big person on the very big...
He's good. He's good. He like Muslim people. It's a good man. Good.
Some young folks en français speaking to The Telegraph back in November about the election prospects of Eric Zemmour. Felicity, who's he?
Eric Zemmour is a very controversial figure who is running in the French elections, which are being held in April. He's a former journalist, so lots of comparisons have been made between him and none other than Boris Johnson. He is sort of causing waves, I suppose, because immigration is a big talking point where he's concerned, and he's said quite a few controversial things. Some of his ideas have been that you should change your name to a Christian name if you want to live in France. So if your name is Ahmed, you should change it to Albert. He doesn't want refugees admitted into France. He's actually been convicted recently for hate speech for some of the things he said about child migrants.
Okay, so that's who he is. What's happened this week?
So this week there was a story that caught my eye in the Times, which was a group of female Muslim football players who have asked the State Council, France's highest administrative court, to quash a ruling by the French Football Federation that headscarves cannot be worn during games. So currently the French Football Federation refuses the hijab on the ground that all speeches or signs of a political, ideological, religious or unionist character are prohibited. And this is obviously a kind of long-running debate that runs through France, and it's all to do really whether Islam is compatible with the French Republic and France's kind of passionate secular status, so to speak. But the reason why it's sort of come up again is that with the elections approaching and the rise seemingly of Eric Zemmour, it looks once again that Islam is going to feature quite heavily.
Yes. I mean, Sorcha, for French people, secularism is a vital part of their national identity, isn't it? It's always there in elections.
Yeah, it's a huge part of French identity. France is visibly a secular country, and the state is officially neutral in matters of religion. It doesn't support religion or the absence of it. There is no official state religion in France. Proponents of this idea of French secularism say it's based on these ideas of respect for freedom of thought and freedom of religion. But obviously in the run-up to the French presidential elections, there's been lots of conversations about the place of secularism in French public life, particularly in terms of the place of Islam in French society. And a lot of people have said that these kinds of ideas of secularism in terms of Islam are being misused, because the idea of secularism in France is about the state, not about individuals. And so if you start saying that people of any religion in their private lives can't display religious symbols or wear headscarves, that's not the state, that's interfering with personal decisions.
Yeah, because, John, there's been long-standing debates and laws in France about religious symbols in schools, for example, but it's kind of unarguable that that's a public space and it's funded by the state, whichever side of the debate you come down on. But it seems like if this was to pass and actually become law, you're saying you couldn't have a Muslim women's football team where the women couldn't wear headscarves. That does seem bizarre and an overreach.
I mean, yeah, the whole thing seems stupid to me, because, I think the government should be dictating to anyone, particularly women, what they should wear. And my answer to that is no. Do I think religious authorities should be dictating to anyone, particularly women, what they can wear? The answer is no. But is it any of my business to tell the French or the religious what to do? Well, no, not really. So it's kind of, it's a massive kind of overreach. And I do think that, I think a lot of this is about politics, which always in my mind boils back down to economics as well. I suppose it is tricky, though, because if you have a group of people who are visibly religious and vociferously religious within a country that has got used to the idea that it's secular, it's pretty hard to kind of pick out something obvious that makes somebody a Catholic, whereas obviously the hijab is kind of, for want of a better word, controversial for lots of reasons. So you can see how we end up getting into this situation.
Is it being applied equally across other religious groups, though, Felicity? I mean, there's a more obvious way to identify Orthodox Jews, for example, isn't there? If they're wearing a kippah or a yarmulke, are they not allowed to wear those when they're playing football?
Well, I mean, theoretically, no. Theoretically, it applies to everyone, that, all kind of obvious religious symbols, are not allowed in lots of different circumstances and settings. But, as John was saying, it's more obvious amongst Muslim women and amongst Muslims. And I think they feel that they're being very much more targeted than anyone else. And also, there's a huge Muslim population in France. I think it's about 5 million. So it's a huge population. And I think they feel that they're being more demonized than anyone else. I think, interestingly, the pandemic context has made it even more acute and annoyed more people, because you have this weird paradox where in 2020 the French authorities made it compulsory for people to wear a mask in various parts of the country, as they did in this country and elsewhere, which covers part of the face. But the niqab, for example, which is kind of the full covering for women, remains prohibited. And as the Washington Post recently pointed out, if an observant Muslim woman wanted to get on the Paris metro, she'd be required to remove her burqa and replace it with a mask. So I think a lot of people, which is, kind of bizarre, but I think a lot of people said, well, this just goes to show that this has got nothing to do with your kind of secular traditions. It's all to do with kind of penalising us unfairly.
And one sports journalist who covers sports in France, Shireen Ahmed, pointed out that male footballers aren't stopped from crossing themselves before they step onto the pitch. That is something that happens frequently, and that's an overt display of religion. And so her argument is to say that women can't wear the hijab, which is also a overt display of religion, is really deliberately excluding Muslim women and is a form of I think she called it gendered Islamophobia.
But there is a double standard you can point to, John, with Islamic dress in particular, which is that there are many Islamic countries that themselves wouldn't make a cultural exception for Western women footballers who wanted to play, in T-shirts and shorts. They wouldn't say, well, that's their culture. They'd say that's not allowed here.
I mean, yeah, I suppose, this is the fundamental problem. I mean, I don't... Again, it's one of those things where I struggle to work out what we can say on this topic that is particularly useful, other than our own opinions. It's like...
Don't deconstruct the whole genre of podcasting, John. We're not here for that.
Well, yeah, well, this is the problem. It's like, I heartily disagree with the idea that anyone should have to wear anything. I don't think that it's a good thing. As I say, if it was my own religion that I'm allowed to criticise, then I would say that no, it's not good that women have to wear a specific type of dress due to some kind of like absolutely deranged view of kind of like patriarchal kind of what modesty is. However, I think that it's very counterproductive to then kind of like try and ban what people do, because it just makes them want to do it more. It's like, I suspect that most of the women in the football team here are not actually being particularly oppressed, or forced to wear what they want. They probably have more of a desire to wear it because they're being told that they can't. So I just think that it's counterproductive to try and kind of force people to not display their religion. I mean, it's happened in Scotland. Like, so, then obviously in Scotland there's kind of like the whole Celtic Rangers Protestant Catholic thing, and one of the ways they tried to crack down on that was by stopping all of the stupid songs that both sides sing, and kind of like making kind of like religious gestures on the pitch. And of course it just annoys everyone. It doesn't actually kind of like contribute to kind of making anyone safer.
Doesn't resolve hundreds of years of religious conflict.
It's so anyway, sorry. I'll shut up now.
I think just to expand on John's point, we're all sitting here in the UK with our own opinions on this, which can only get us so far. And I think it is important to recognise the kind of almost unique situation in France. I mean, none of us are French and none of us live in France right now, but there is, when you remember what France has been through recently, that this is a nation completely haunted by really extreme, brutal Islamist terrorism. They are really in quite a sort of particular and unique and horrifying bind of their own.
Well, it's particularly bad there, but it's not as if the spectre of Islamist terrorism hasn't visited London and other European capitals as well. And this tension that says Islam effectively, at any degree, is incompatible with our way of life is not something that has traction in Britain in the same way that it does in France. And why is that?
Yeah, I mean, I still wouldn't say it's quite the same thing. I still don't think it's comparable. I think France is a unique case, and it's just such a huge problem there. And like some of, I don't like the idea of sort of branding anyone as Islamophobic just for pointing out the fact that there is a really serious problem. And actually, some of the terrorists in France, it's quite clear that they're not lone wolves or anomalies, that they had family and friends and mosques and ideological surroundings that were laying the groundwork for their radicalism. And that people in France are very, very scared of it, and they want to see action taken. Now, whether that should result in a bunch of girls who want to play football not being allowed to wear a headscarf, I mean, that just seems like such an overreach and incredibly clumsy. But the issue about what to do in the country, I think, is a valid one. And I don't like Eric Zemmour. I think he's bad news. I think he is racist, and some of the stuff he says is horrible and polarizing and divisive. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a huge issue that needs to be addressed and will probably come up in the elections.
But when people in Britain think of the French hard right, their mind still, I think, jumps to Le Pen. But actually, Zemmour is very much in the race, isn't he?
Yes, Zemmour is currently second in the presidential pollings. And, what he's done, a successful tactic for him has been to tap into this idea of French decline. So a recent Ipsos poll found that only 25% of French people say that France is not in decline, and 62% say that they don't feel at home like they used to, and 64% say there are too many immigrants in the country. France is, I think, increasingly hostile to, or clearly is increasingly hostile to immigration, and he's very much tapping into this idea of French decline and leaning very heavily on the ideas of, the good old days of post-war France.
And John, on a kind of geopolitical basis, there's a sense that obviously there was a rise in populism 4, 5, 6 years ago, Brexit in this country, Trump in America, etc. And that France is due its moment because Le Pen's always been there. But this is new. is this their moment? Or if you're someone who desperately doesn't want that kind of thing to happen in France, are you someone who can say, well, they missed the boat, actually? Populism was 4 years ago. We've had a pandemic since. They're not going to go for this.
I think people mischaracterised populism. Macron was the populist vote in France. He came from nowhere and he upturned the establishment. And it just so happens that he was slightly more palatable to the people who were whining about populism in Britain and America. The other problem is that there's this sort of like term, the hard right and the far right, has been badly abused over the last 4 years to be applied to people who are frankly anything but. It's like, you've got Boris Johnson being described as like hard right or far right by people all over the place here, and he just isn't. He's nothing like. I mean, the BNP is hard right. That is not what Boris Johnson is. So I think that's the first point I would make. The second point I would make is that actually, even though yes, Zemmour has kind of like nipped up the polls, if you look at the betting odds, he's still in distant third place. And the way that the French presidential system works, it's highly unlikely that he would get to win anyway. So the other person who's more likely to kind of be up against Macron is Valérie Pécresse, who is kind of centre-right as far as I'm aware. So I don't think that this is going to be an issue. It does point to an underlying problem, which is that clearly a large number of French people feel out of control of the situation in their country. And that particular boil hasn't been lanced in the way that I think it has been in Britain, for example. But I think that they're going to have to wait for longer. I very much doubt that this election is going to bring either Zemmour or Le Pen into power.
Yeah, I think I would have thought actually Macron will get a second term, which in itself is quite unusual because I think all his predecessors have failed to do so. I think the kind of the storm around Eric Zemmour is abating slightly. I think his convictions for things that he's said will not play out very well. But I think even the fact that he's being talked about at all and is on the scene is noteworthy. The fact that Napoleon and Charles de Gaulle are his idols, the fact that the French like their presence to be exceptional, the fact that he's hated by the elites but loved by millions. It is fascinating. You can't help but draw comparisons with Johnson and Trump. So I think the fact that he's even there and he's creating such huge waves is interesting, but I agree that I don't think he's going to come to power. I do think what will remain for a very, very long time is this question mark over what to do. Well, how France treats its Muslim population, basically.
Okay, John, you're up next after this. Okay, John, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are we facing a return to the 1970s?
Since notching a win in early December, 2 Buffalo cafes have formally organized, and more than 30 from Boston to Seattle are seeking to do the same, collaborating with baristas in Buffalo via Zoom. Starbucks Workers United said the speed has been surprising as young workers seek to improve their earnings and working conditions, referring to them as a part of Generation U for unions.
Kate Rogers reporting for CNBC on Tuesday. Generation U, John. Explain.
Well, this is partly a broader story. So that clip is about Starbucks workers trying to unionise and managing to get a bit of a foothold, at least in an area that has been historically rather opposed to unions. But also this week in Britain, we've seen that the baggage handlers at Heathrow are threatening to go on strike during the February half-term. And they're looking for retrospective pay increases for 2020 and 2021. But the exact details don't matter. The point here is more that they're not the only ones. So like a quick Google search this morning, I found that last month kind of bin collectors went on strike in Eastbourne and won a massive wage hike. There's a similar strike going on in Coventry right now. There's threats of strikes by bus drivers in Swindon, more strikes from university staff. And there's even been the threat of action at the Financial Conduct Authority, which is not exactly a hub of hard left radicalism. So the question now is, well, are we actually heading for a point where we see much more strike action, much more unrest?
Well, and the answer is yes, because the cost of living is going up. I mean, that's the big headline of the week, isn't it? We all know we're going to have to pay more bills, so of course people want higher wages.
Exactly, and they're quite right to. But this is the sort of thing that really worries economists and central bankers, because this is how you get into a wage price spiral, which is, if you do want me to explain it.
Hold on to your seats, everybody.
It's really straightforward. If you want higher wages, Ollie, say, then your employer has to raise the cost of buying this podcast from its current low rates. And then what happens is that people say, wait, the price of podcasts are going up. I'd better get a wage rise as well. And then they go and get a wage rise from their employer, and the employer puts up its own prices to cover the wage costs. And so gradually you just get wage rises, beget price rises, beget wage rises, beget price rises, and so on.
Okay, is this sort of boffin theory, though, or is this an identifiable recurrent financial predicament? It's not just an intellectual way of seeing market forces. It's a thing.
Oh, no, it's a thing. I mean, the question is, the causation is often rather tangled up, and there's always lots of different kind of like views on it, as there is with everything in economics. But in the 1970s, for example, it was definitely a thing where, you know, kind of like unions would go on strike for more wages. They'd get paid the higher wages, but inflation kind of took off because prices went up. And it was all part of the kind of chaos of that decade. And the question now is that because of that decade, this is one of the things that central banks in particular, but governments also want to avoid. Because while a bit of inflation is fine, if you get to kind of like, you know, well, actually that much higher than we are now, it starts to become very disruptive to the social order, basically.
Okay, but I mean, Sorcha, you're a young person. Captain Moneybags here is pointing out the dangers to the economy and the central banks of people like you joining unions. I don't know if you're in the NUJ or whatever, but if you were a Starbucks worker or a luggage handler and you're just looking for a fair price rise, it's not really your concern, is it, what that's going to do to the economy?
I think, yes, these kinds of jobs are often looked at as kind of low-skilled jobs, you know, Starbucks, restaurant workers, HGV drivers. But actually what we found is that they are crucial to the functioning of our economy, to the functioning of our society. If there's a demand for them because of labour shortages, then I think, of course, their contribution and their importance in our economy and our society should be recognised with fair pay so that they can, you know, have a good standard of living.
And therefore, Felicity, if those people aren't going to be talked down by thinking about macroeconomic factors, this wage price spiral that John refers to does seem like something that could be around the corner. Is that something that concerns you?
Yeah, definitely. The more I've had to look into it to research for this podcast, the more it definitely does seem worrying. I think the two things that I'm interested in knowing more about with inflation is how Brexit has affected it. Was it something that was exacerbated? Has it been exacerbated by fewer low-wage workers? You know, is it the fact that as a result of Brexit, there are fewer wage workers and that has contributed to inflation? And sort of how pre-Brexit immigration policy was that kind of used as a tool to keep inflation from spiralling in the way that it is doing now? And also, I suppose, where has it come from, I suppose, is what I would want to know, because I find that really, really interesting. And how has the pandemic impacted it? It made me think, I'm sure I did a podcast ages ago when John was on about MMT, modern monetary theory, and the kind of the magic money tree that everyone was talking about at the outset of the pandemic, you know, that certain countries that have their own currency, like Japan, the US, the UK, they can just kind of print money. And certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, when we were all panicking, that was kind of what everyone seemed very enamored with. And now along comes inflation, and is it looking like MMT wasn't a good idea, doesn't work, and actually inflation is actually really, really worrying?
I mean, those are all excellent questions. On Brexit, that one's hotly debated in terms of the impact on low-wage workers. My view would be that if you remove some of the competition for low-wage work, then your wages and conditions are going to improve because employers need to attract people. And that has happened. A lot of economists who sort of, if you like, were anti-Brexit denied that would happen as a result of Brexit. And you'll still get a lot of debate over that. But I think overall it's a minor effect because this inflation is happening everywhere. It's not just Britain. So the US certainly can't That's got nothing to do with Brexit. Inflation in Italy has got nothing to do with Brexit. So it's a global problem.
So where's it coming from then?
Well, it's the pandemic, but also the reactions to the pandemic. So there's two things. So what happened was that there's a massive hit to supply of goods because everyone shut down for a while. And in the meantime, governments actually spent a lot of money on protecting workforces, which is a good thing because, if you're going to force businesses to shut for a public health emergency, you can't then just put everyone on the dole because it's entirely unfair because it's been mandated by the government. So what happened was that most people's spending power stayed the same, but the quantity of goods in the economy absolutely fell off a cliff. So that's one thing that's driven inflation up. But now that we're coming out, the authorities would like to pretend that it'll all go away once the supply chains are unravelled again. But it's more complicated than that because the labour force has also been massively diminished because a lot of people have left the labour force either because of early retirement or just because they get fed up and kind of, move jobs. So on the one hand, we've got kind of lots of job vacancies and yet we've also got extremely low unemployment. So that's the other thing that's driving wages up. There's not enough people to fill the jobs, and whether the employers like it or not, they have to shell out to get people into those jobs.
And also generational savviness, perhaps, Sorcha. I mean, people now head onto social networks, don't they, to find out what people should be paid, quote unquote, for certain jobs. We were talking, weren't we, on the show a few months ago about wages being advertised for jobs in a much clearer way and on a clearer scale than they have been before. That looks like something that's going to grow.
Yeah, I think that is certainly a part of it. I think, younger people are much more open about, as you say, talking about wages. I don't think there's the same sort of taboo in talking about how much you earn. There's lots of recognition that talking about how much you earn can be a good thing for women and ethnic minorities and other people who are kind of maybe traditionally underpaid. And I think, there is also, I'm kind of thinking about Reddit forums like anti-work, where there is this sense that there is a push to not be forced to accept working conditions that are bad, that people want, especially after the kind of pandemic where we've, been able to work from home and have kind of more personal time to ourselves. I don't think many people, especially young people who entered the workforce at that sort of time, necessarily want to go back to working all hours of the day for very little pay and in unsafe working conditions.
But then that's kind of complicated as well, isn't it, Felicity? Because if, for example, Sorcha's right and more people work from home or negotiate to work from home or work a 3 or 4 day week rather than a 5 day week from home, then I'd imagine that the bills are going to come down because the company's not paying for a big heated office. I mean, does it actually equal out somewhere down the line and people don't need to panic about this?
I imagine it's still kind of in a period of flux. I feel like everything's sort of been thrown up in the air and we haven't actually got into a groove where we can see what the ramifications are. I mean, certainly in terms of working from home and going back into the office, that just seems like a big mess that people are still doing what they want to do. I certainly feel like the shift I feel like the power balance has gone back to the employees who, and I've seen that in how we at the moment have been recruiting people and sort of staff changes. I mean, everything has been really, really shaken up, but I think there is a lot more power, as Sorcha was saying, on the employees' side of things. I'm not surprised that there's more unionising activity. I think one of the most interesting kind of phenomenons of the pandemic was this whole great resignation of people just sort of throwing it in and saying, I'm out of here, which again, I think we've yet to see what sort of comes of that and what it means. But certainly people who are maybe chasing more flexible work, more part-time work, sort of following their passion a bit more rather than doing the same old job for years and years and years and years. And I think the world of work has changed fundamentally. Part of that, I think you will see more strikes and sort of clawing back even more power, and especially with the cost of living rising, sort of real growing dissatisfaction that this isn't working for people.
Yeah, so where do people go politically, John? Because you've made reference to the 70s a couple of times. But the political result of the 70s ultimately was Thatcherism, wasn't it? But this time we've got a Conservative government. So where do people go, if things do go very pear-shaped?
I mean, again, I just don't think that the politics kind of moulds itself. So the reason that we had Thatcher at the end of the 70s was because there was a long period where Labour actually was in the ascendancy. So, the miners could shut down the country, literally. And so the population as a whole got sick of that and voted in Thatcher. The difference now is that we've had 40 years of the pendulum swinging the other way. So it's a kind of very well-known phenomenon that the proportion of earnings and profits going to capital has been increasing and that to Labour has been falling. So it's a very long-term thing. There are a lot of other trends beyond the pandemic that are forcing this, but the pandemic probably accelerated it. But you see, that's a political thing. So even if you look even at the Conservatives, they're not actually going to complain or push back against this. I mean, the whole levelling up agenda is kind of pro Labour, as in Labour the workers. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that the Tories are going to win. You might get a swing to somebody who's more visibly left-wing, but the point is that it's an underlying trend that will drag the Overton window, if you like, towards the left. And whoever's running the country, to an extent, doesn't matter. It's just this is what people want now, and it won't swing back until inflation's become so disruptive that people start to get fed up with it.
Okay, Sorcha, you're up next after this. Okay, Sorcha, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Should we fear the arrival of spring?
Visitors here at Ham House in London have noticed something is definitely going on.
I've noticed that things do seem to come out earlier. I haven't approached it particularly scientifically, but behind me you can see the daffodils.
The blossoms have been out earlier, the wisterias come out a lot earlier. Daffodils are all out, whereas they used to be March.
Visitors in the gardens at Ham House in London speaking to 5 News on Wednesday. Sorcha, what's the story?
So rising global temperatures mean that spring is set to arrive a month early this year in the UK, as warmer temperatures mean flowers are blooming early. So a team of researchers from Cambridge University studied 400,000 records from a science database called Nature's Calendar. And the team found that, on average, the first flowering date of UK plants is a month earlier than it was before 1986. And it shows a strong correlation with our warming climate. So scientists warn that if rising temperatures continue at the same rate, then spring could start in February in the UK.
Okay, I mean, you're doing doomy voice, and obviously, any stats on climate change can seem concerning, but spring starting a month early is probably a prize most of us would be happy with. What's the problem?
Right now I am praying for spring to come, but actually early blooming can have a really devastating effect on the UK's ecology through a phenomenon called ecological mismatch. And that is essentially when the life cycle of different species, which rely on each other for survival, fall out of sync. And that can have this huge knock-on effect throughout our entire ecosystems. So, for example, if there is a mismatch between the nesting of birds and the life cycle of caterpillars are less likely to be hunted in their early lives, which in turn have a knock-on effect in terms of trees, and then in turn that has an effect on other insects that graze on them and on the animals that feed those insects. And so it's kind of a cycle of kind of ecological collapse.
Yeah, but that synchronicity, Felicity, that we see between birds and caterpillars and between plants and animals and all the rest of it, that is something that develops over time naturally, considering whatever the circumstances are. So can they not resync? Can, flowers and animals not adapt to this?
I'm not the expert. I would have thought they could eventually, but I don't know how long that would take and what the negative ramifications in the meantime would be. I mean, certainly right now it seems very, very mild for February. And I mean, I kind of completely agree with Sorcha. It's lovely getting daffodils and tulips from the shops and it feeling a bit warmer. And you are kind of have this false sense that spring is here, and then you remember that you're still supposed to be in winter. But I mean, you're quite right that, you know, nature has always kind of adapted to the pressures that we've placed on it. You know, the sort of famous example of the moths, I can't remember what type of moth it was, under the Industrial Revolution, who managed to change as the kind of trees, I think it was buildings got sooty and there was more soot, they managed to camouflage themselves to blend in with this more industrial environment. I'm sure that nature is tenacious and resilient and will find a way to deal with the demands and horrendous pressures we place on it. I suppose it's whether it should have to, and what the kind of the negative implications in the meantime are. But I mean, it's fascinating on the Week Junior actually, because our readers love animals and the environment, and they get very concerned and they're very upset about environmental things. And you know, the idea of eco anxiety is very, very real, and it's kind of upsetting to see that. But I feel like recently there has been this phenomenon where you'd see a story and ostensibly think this is a really great thing, you know, and we have bits in the magazine like it's an amazing week, and you'd put it's an amazing week for people who love spring because the daffodils are here, or it's an amazing week because this sort of, I don't know,
amazing week for caterpillars,
or an amazing week for like a Jamaican sparrow that's turned up in the UK, and you would never get these birds in the UK type thing, and this is great. And then we suddenly think, to our horror, like, oh, hang on a second, is this a good thing? Is this an amazing thing? Because actually, deep down, surely this is the planet warming up, which is our readers' biggest fear. So it's strange times.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, John, that this story that Sorcha has brought us came primarily from The Telegraph. So I had a look through the comments on it, and you can see that The Telegraph now clearly has, you know, climate change correspondence and is pretty much towing the line on climate change being a serious issue. But their readers are still clearly very sceptical. They say this isn't news. You're looking for news. You're looking to make us eco-anxious. The weather's always changing. And if the whole concern about this is basically there's going to be a late frost in April that will kill off the early blooming plants, then that is evidence that the world isn't warming up because you're getting a cold frost in April. Now, I know it isn't as simple as that, but it is true that there are people who are paid to generate stories on the climate now.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. And I'm, look, I don't have strong kind of views on what is causing all of this, because I think it's really complicated and obviously human beings must be involved in some way. I do think
I'm feeling a butt coming.
I do think that eco-anxiety is, to be fair, kind of somewhat media generated. And I do remember when I was a kid, it's like all that we talked about was the Cold War and how we were all going to die in a nuclear war. And the teachers sort of encouraged that to a great extent. And actually, the syllabus encouraged it. I mean, Z for Zachariah is a terrible book, but everyone had to read it at primary school if they're over the age of 40. Yeah. So I'm just saying that, and I remember that literally the instant the Berlin Wall fell, suddenly there was a hole in the ozone layer. And then once we plugged that, and once we stopped the acid rain from being a problem in America, the kind of global warming kind of became the big issue. And none of that is to say that any of it isn't. But you're right. I mean, something like this is, I mean, if, as you say, if somebody's making the kind of argument that this is a bad thing because if flowers come out early, they'll get killed later by surprise kind of frosts, then that's just not a very good argument. And it does make you think, like, this is really being drummed up as an eye-catching kind of story.
It's interesting you say that, because I know the researchers they really thought that what this study would show is that there is kind of completely undeniable, unavoidable evidence of kind of the consequences of climate change and what it might mean, because, you know, if the seasons change and people can go outside and see that clearly spring is coming earlier and plants are blooming earlier, then they can no longer deny that kind of climate change is real and is coming and could potentially have catastrophic effects. So it's interesting that I kind of see that you're maybe not taking the study as the researcher intended.
It's not really that, Sorcha. I mean, I don't really need convincing that climate change is happening. But it's just at this stage, it's like, okay, right, so it's visible that spring's happening earlier, but how is that going to get China to use less coal? It's not. Do you know what I mean? There's a massive disconnect between what is possible to stop this. And the kind of like constant harping on from the eco people about how, oh, you should do this and you should do that. Well, actually, no, we need to operate within the parameters of what is possible. And shutting down the entire global economy forever in the absence of a pandemic is not a viable option, because nobody's going to agree to that.
But there are local versions of this story, aren't there? So, I mean, we're talking about daffodils at Ham House, but obviously that's not going to have residents in China, fair enough. But there are Chinese versions. There are Japanese versions, aren't there, Felicity? There's Cherry Blossom that came out early last year. It does have a primal thing, doesn't it? It's something everyone can relate to. They see it and they understand it.
Yeah, I actually find it quite... I see what you mean, John, about the sort of like fear mongering, and of course the media does that with all sorts of things. They do it with COVID as well. You know, you're not allowed to relax for a single second when you read the news at the moment. There's always something to be terrified of, and to kind of retreat back into the safety of your home. But I do find it slightly reassuring, actually, that if you have had this slight uneasy feeling that it feels slightly too warm, and that the daffodils are coming early, and that this is also happening with the cherry blossom in Japan or flowers in Africa or something, that it's nice to have someone give voice to what you were sort of thinking, this doesn't seem quite right, and to someone say like, yeah, I'm sort of feeling the same thing, and like, oh yeah, it's happening to me too. You know, this... I agree that it's kind of counterproductive, and there's not an awful lot that can be done about it. And there could also be some benefits and some good things that we hadn't considered. It doesn't all have to be doom and gloom. But I do find it slightly reassuring when someone actually says, yeah, I've noticed this too. This is happening, and it didn't used to be like this. You know, the world is changing.
And I largely agree with John. I mean, obviously, just being constantly, we know that climate change is happening, or hopefully the majority of us agree that climate change is happening, and actually what is needed is kind of concrete action in a reasonable and actually achievable way. But I do think studies like this are good in kind of achieving its aims, in that we are not allowed to forget, and we're not allowed to kind of put it to the back of our minds and say, oh well, this is going to be sorted out later, I'm sure, you know, fingers crossed it'll all be fine. If kind of we're confronted with these, you know, empirical realities, then hopefully that can lead to actually some sort of push for, you know, achievable, reasonable change, so that we don't, you know, London's not swallowed by the River Thames in however long, 50 years. So,
or just an epidemic of daffodils slowly burgeoning their way from Ham House. All right, trowels down, everybody. Best in Show medals all round. My thanks to Sorcha and Felicity and John. Like I say, we hope to have you back again soon. In the meantime, can people still hear you on the Money Week podcast?
Yes. moneyweek.com/podcasts.
Remember, you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. And if you found us today via a Spotify playlist, then tap go to podcast and then tap follow now. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.